She studied under Ambrose Raftis at the University of Toronto, one of the great social historians. Social history is the study of ordinary people, and it was a revolution in the way history was done in the 1960s and 1970s. Anne is here to give you a context. You've been hearing about these court roles and manor roles. She's going to talk to you a little bit about how historians read these texts and what we do with them. Anne.
Thank you, Stephen. My approach to the study of village life has been by means of medieval manuscripts which recorded the business that took place in local courts. I first got hooked on manorial court rolls many years ago when I was a graduate student at the University of Toronto. There was something compelling about records from a medieval village that seemed almost theatrical. Ordinary men and women took center stage, asserting their identities as brewsters, jurors, reeves, sureties, creditors, tenants, and every now and then simply troublemakers. The manorial court, despite the fact that it was an institution designed to protect the interests of landlords, does provide a stage for medieval villagers who transcend the flat, insignificant labels of peasant or serf. I would need to monopolize the entire conference schedule, however, to do justice to the many other scholars who have exploited manorial court rolls. So I'll now focus mainly on data gleaned from my own work with Huntingdonshire peasants. I've been studying the court rolls from Ramsey Abbey, which survived from the mid-13th century and diminish in numbers over the course of the late 15th century. Court rolls are most informative when historians study them along with other manorial and royal documents. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'll focus almost exclusively on manorial courts. My plan is to introduce 6 of the topics that have dominated recent research agendas. Then I can illustrate how court rolls contribute to these conversations by providing examples of relevant court roll entries. I'll begin with the topic of women and village families. My own work on the manorial court rolls of the village of Warboys has allowed me to speculate on the issue of peasant agency through a prosopographical study of the villagers identified by the surname Beringer. Approximately 60 individuals bearing this surname were active between 1250 and 1500. There are enough entries in the rolls to reveal an astounding variety in their personal profiles. Variety is best illustrated by describing the careers of 2 quite different family groups. Robert Beringer was remarkable for his regular refusal to cooperate with the manorial regime and his reluctance to fulfill the social responsibilities usually associated with tenants of his level. Of the 33 references to Robert, 10 are citations for failure to perform work services or, in one case, for failure to perform them properly. On one occasion, he simply, quote, did not care to show up at the harvest. Another 6 references to Robert are to trespasses, often with livestock, into meadow, woods, or grain of the Lord. In a very unusual court roll entry, Robert was even accused by 6 of his fellow jurors of, quote, presenting badly. Robert did serve as witness to charters and as a pledge, but almost 1/2 of his recorded activity took the form of non-involvement or non-cooperation. Unlike Robert, William Beringer, a tenant of 15 acres in 1298, rather than simply refuse to perform labor services, was willing to pay 13 pence to purchase a temporary release from that obligation. Also distinguishing himself from Robert, William had been willing to hold office. He was elected beadle in 1294, was juror that same year, and had served as capital pledge and juror back in 1290. There were also two John Berengers with their own distinctive profiles and whose careers overlapped between 1347 and 87. Of the 18 references to this two-generation family, 7 entries refer to a John's service as juror, constable, and ale taster, or pledge. As a tenant of at least 15 acres, he apparently decided to undertake the official duties usually associated with such property. Whereas the John Berengers shared with Robert the inclination to invest in livestock, Robert was more willing to lend and borrow money and was probably more aggressively involved in the local land market. Another example will reveal further options open to 15th century branches of this prolific clan. 3 generations of William Berengers acquired various plots of land at a time when the abbot was having a hard time finding tenants. One William appears exclusively as a man eager to take up land abandoned by others. He acquired 1 plot and 30 acres in 1417 on condition that he not give up any other lands that he holds. As a well-endowed tenant, he was either willing to serve regularly as manor court juror or was pressured into service due to his relative wealth. There is no surviving evidence of conflict with other jurors. Toward the middle of the 15th century, another William Berenger extended his investments beyond the village. He inherited property from his parents, but he also invested in the fen resources of the neighboring village of Wistow. This particular William, however, apparently refused to serve in any local office, even though his father was the Lord's bailiff. Warboys' court rolls provide hints of family strategy, however, as well as individual agency. Younger sons were able to acquire property in the village, along with their older brothers. John Berenger Jr. paid an entry fine in 1412 to gain access to a mundyman land. So he was able to establish his own family, which eventually included 2 daughters. William Berenger, as John Jr.'s older brother and their father's heir, did not need to acquire land of his own as soon as did his younger brother. It was not until 1425 and 38 when he received 15 acres from his father and later a house and a croft, quote, in partnership with his father. The Berengers illustrate once again the variety of peasant experiences. Indeed, it has been noted in 5 Ramsey Abbey villages, including Warboys, quote, among the most common customary units, there was only a 10% chance that 2 villagers would hold properties of the same size. Furthermore, each 30-acre tenement, or fraction thereof, represented an investment in a variety of resources which could be exploited according to individual and family strategies. As Ambrose Raftus explained, quote, there was the physical homestead proper, that is the messwage and its main house, outbuildings such as granges along with gardens and orchards. There were also rights to common in fen, marsh, and meadow, and arable was spread throughout the open fields in units available for subletting. Little wonder that customary tenants could thus be considered as taking on the role of entrepreneurs and able to exercise, quote, their range of decision-making. As for women, the Warboys records reveal clues to the nature of their choices within 3 broad contexts: marriage, trades, and migration. The active involvement of male relatives in the decision process regarding marriage alliances is often evident when those relatives paid the license fee. When Mariota Beringer married a butcher based in the nearby town of Ramsey in 1450, her brother Richard paid the license fee. Margaret Beringer may have acted without family approval, therefore, when she married, quote, without license, an unnamed freeman, resulting in a rather high fine of 13 shillings and 4 pence. Similarly, when Joan Beringer married John Weston in 1406, he paid the license fee, not Joan's father or brother. Weston was an outsider, probably from Abbotsripton, with no Warboys property. Perhaps this marriage was Joan's decision and was not encouraged by her family. Beringer access to major tenements in Warboys was also certainly a factor in the complex decision-making process that preceded marriage alliances. In 1408, Richard Smith paid 13 shillings 4 pence for license to marry Catherine, daughter of Richard Beringer. A couple of years after this Beringer-Smith union, Catherine's father stood as surety for his son-in-law when he acquired 1.5 Beergate in Warboys. The investment Richard Smith made in the marriage fine thus paid off. Even though Beringer women had access to land primarily through their husbands and fathers, there are a few fascinating exceptions. Catherine Atwood was a joint tenant in 1414 with another woman, Mary Wine, and the tenement in question was previously held by Juliana Packrell. In 1423, Joanna Bowd surrendered several properties to a man and his wife on condition that she could keep a certain room, a shed for impounding animals, and access to the bakehouse for brewing. Many peasant women chose the brewing and victualler trades to supplement personal and family income. It's been suggested that women's labor was used in this manner primarily by smaller tenants. Indeed, only 4 Beringer women were fined for ale infractions in the 14th century court rolls, and there is no other evidence of Beringer women involving themselves in trades other than brewing. This was either not an attractive option for women of their family's wealth and status, or the demands of their investments in livestock and arable tenements precluded that opportunity. The second topic that I'd like to discuss is the village and regional economy. In an effort to keep track of a rather large number of individuals sharing the forename John and the surname Beringer, the court rolls provide extra labels indicating a range of occupations, including carpenter, wright, and even pewterer. A John Beringer was reported in 1483 to be off to London to take up that rather specialized trade. John Beringer Carpenter had presumably left for the nearby village of Little Stutely. And the John Beringer Wright maintained an interest in agriculture as he took up a life tenancy in 1401. Decisions thus had to be made about how best to invest one's labor and capital. Some acquired more land while others pursued a craft or perhaps worked for wages. And I just recently noticed reference to a spice which was used to pay a fine in 1306. One of the abbey's tenants paid, quote, 2 pounds of cumin while he dwells at Hilton, revealing his access to the Mediterranean spice trade, probably through the fair at St. Ives, just 4 miles from Hilton. The third topic one can investigate has to do with village government and county politics. Some village leaders also held more prestigious offices associated with royal authority, such as village coroner, tax assessor, and heir court juror. My current research project involves an attempt to identify the manorial court jurors who appear in the election indentures of 15th century Huntingdonshire, indicating their participation in county court sessions where members of parliament were elected. As of now, I can estimate that at least 24% of 263 named parliamentary electors from the first half of the 15th century were manorial jurors, and thus perhaps worthy of the label peasant. A fourth topic could be social mobility. John Beringer provides an interesting example of what some might consider to be upward social mobility, because his ancestors were serfs. A John Beringer served as the Abbey's bailiff in Warboys, and 40 years later, another John had leased the manorial domain, perhaps resulting as well in his, quote, election to the office of village constable by 1483. Constables were chosen at the leet courts as a means of preserving order prior to the creation of a professional police force. Another example of upward mobility is provided by the son of a Beringer who died in London, having composed a will identifying himself as a chaplain. A 1440 manorial court roll from Warboys reveals that Richard, son of John Beringer, was outside the manor at the town of Ramsey, where he was at school. Richard was apparently able to acquire the education he needed at the Abbey's almonry school and was ordained to the priesthood in spite of the fact that he and his father were serfs. Another topic is geographic mobility. Falling regional rents and rising wages may have provided powerful incentives to leave Warboys. The court rolls and the Liber Summarum kept record of at least some of the residents of Warboys who emigrated from their birth village. For example, John and Richard Beringer, the sons of yet another William, emigrated to Lincolnshire, where Richard was living when he purchased his manumission in 1468. Women as well as men left Ramsey villages in large numbers. These numbers increased over time, with a major shift in the percentage of women emigrants. While only about 10% of the Warboys emigrants during the course of the 14th century were women, about 40% from the first half of the 15th century were women. Several Beringer daughters left Warboys in the 1440s and 60s, either before or soon after they married. Joan, daughter of John Beringer Jr., apparently acted without financial help from a father or brother when she paid 20 shillings, quote, to marry whom she wishes. She and her sister Christina then left Warboys for London. Other women simply emigrated with no indication that marriage was part of the plan. Joan, daughter of John Beringer, went to Surrey in 1462, and Catherine was reported to be in Bedfordshire from 1455 to 83. She must have left her home village at a fairly young age, but apparently kept in touch with relatives back in Warboys because they were able to report her current residence to the manorial jurors. Finally, there's the topic of legal status and the common law. Villeins were obviously attracted to the services provided by royal courts because their landlords made an effort to limit that access. Villeins were not allowed to bring suit in royal courts against their lords, and they could also be fined by their lords if they lost chattels because of fines imposed by royal courts. However, some manorial courts countenanced the right of villeins to dispose of their chattels by means of an oral will, i.e. a deathbed transfer. And an even more surprising entry was provided by an Essex court roll. Quote, "It is the custom that any villein of the Lord and anyone holding in the Lord's bondage, ill and languishing, not able to go to court, can surrender into the hands of the reeve or beadle his tenements, so that the reeve or beadle in court can surrender the tenement into the Lord's hands in favor of the purchasers," unquote. Bonfield and Poos thus claimed that, quote, "the customary deathbed transfer allowed the tenant greater flexibility than that permitted the freeholder. In form, it was tantamount to a bequest of land by will." In the end, John Hatcher has challenged many assumptions about the implication of villein status, concluding that, quote, "there can be no doubt whatsoever, after studying manorial records, that the unfree who paid their rent and performed their services almost invariably enjoyed an absolute hereditary security of tenure, which rivaled that enjoyed by the free." I'll conclude with a cautionary note about manorial court records. As with any primary source, there are always weaknesses. Mark Bailey pointed out that manorial court rolls, quote, "only focus upon specific aspects of medieval life. They are only concerned with the manor, which is not necessarily coterminous with a village or parish. And like any court, they tend to record exceptional events rather than workaday life. Many issues and social groups are underrepresented or absent entirely, i.e. women, free tenants, minors, and other non-tenants, as well as the lower ranks of society." But just to finish, I'd like to share two rather dramatic examples of entries from the 1306 War Boys Court Roll, each of which would provide fodder, I think, for an entertaining historical novel. Number one, quote, "The jurors say that Juliana Laban badly beat Matilda Fine in her own home, for which Matilda justly raised the hue and cry upon her. Thereupon Juliana is in mercy for 6 pence, pledge William Reeve." Second example, quote, "It is determined by the jurors that John Laponder unjustly defamed Thomas Raven the beadle, calling him useless in the Lord's service, and even more outrageous things, to his damages of 6 pence, which he shall pay him. And for trespass, etc., 6 pence, pledge Simon Gerald." Our lack of access to the stories behind these dramatic entries is indeed frustrating, perhaps encouraging a bit of sympathy for an outrageous comment published by Herbert Hallam back in 1988 when he wrote, quote, "A peasant diary from the 12th century would be worth all the pipe rolls and Curia Regis rolls in the public record office." I can't support that, but I thought it was a dramatic way to end the paper.